Our trip started in Kathmandu. This is the Tamil neighborhood where most visitors coming for climbs or treks throughout the Khumbu Himalaya region spend a few days, usually gathering last-minute gear. Our own team spent some time gathering gear, although it wasn't climbing or trekking gear. However, it was construction gear for wind turbine parts and solar power equipment that we were going to be using up at high altitude. The box you saw in that last photo is actually 15-foot double-paned solar glass tubes that had to make it on this flight into the Himalaya. These were going to be used at about 15,000-foot village, testing some solar power possibilities. We were headed to Lukla, which is one of the world's most dangerous landing strips. It's about a 12% grade, 1,200 feet. It begins and ends at two cliffs into the mountainside here. You land at 9,000 feet in Lukla. We had some work to do before we set off on foot that day, and it was early morning still. Unfortunately, as we were unloading, but not unexpectedly, some of these solar tubes did arrive broken upon our landing. One of the most fun parts of the trip was the people we met along the way. It started early here in Lukla with this Australian team that was helping us sort through our glass tubes and other gear to see what was damaged and what was okay. These guys had just come off of climbing Mira Peak that morning. The transport of this box plagued us for the next several days till it made its destination in Dingboche at about 15,500 feet. We also started to notice one of the biggest problems really exacerbated by the international mountaineering and climbing community this early in the trip as well: plastics. Here's a good view of that landing strip, and yes, that really is a sheer drop at the end of the runway that you see. Visual signs of conservation efforts started right away too, but we were soon to discover that a lot of this was more appearances than actual efforts or work being done to make a difference throughout the region. Lukla is the high altitude pit stop for all the knockoff gear you could possibly want to find. On our way back, when I saw my bag disappear into a black hole somewhere, I thought, that's where they get this gear they resell up here. The Nat Geo scientists leading our expedition had all kinds of information to give us along the way, such as these baskets that are made by the Rai people, who are actually from the lower hills of Nepal, but are now taking over most of the trekking and porter work. These lower foothills, we were engulfed in amazing evergreen and many species of rhododendron forests as we were going up the Dudkosi River valleys into the park. We didn't get why they were suggesting that glass was better than cans here until later on in the trip we started to find the landfills that were full of crushed cans they had been trying to burn along with all the plastics and other trash you'll soon see. Just one of many of the first river crossings over some raging glacial waters coming out of the Himalaya here. This was leading us into Namche Bazaar, where we arrived on our second day, and it's really the unofficial capital of the Khumbu Himalaya region. It's the last real place of a city-like feel and numbers of people and gatherings. It is a very unique place, the way it's carved out of this bowl in the side of a mountain with a couple thousand-foot drop into the valley below it. At the top of Namche Bazaar is the headquarters of Sagarmatha National Park. That's Tam Serku towering in the distance there, and that is the actual park headquarters building you see. Tam Serku is about 6,600 meters. This is the house just over the mountain we ran over that day where Sir Edmund Hillary stayed quite a bit. It's the family's home of one of the gentlemen that works for the organization I was traveling with, the Mountain Institute, along with National Geographic. And this is our way back down into Namche. We made this trip over this mountainside several times throughout the duration of this trek, both before and after. At first it seemed like quite a trek. By the end it was a quick hop over. Thomas Culhane was one of the energy specialists in Nat Geo Explorer that we were traveling with. He specializes in biogas energy, as you can see here, trying to prove to all of us the heat generated by waste like that. And this was our first view of Everest, actually, early on in the trip, from quite a distance still. This is also about where I started questioning other travelers along the way. we were noticing the incredible loads that were being carried by the porters, Sherpas, and Rai people, and a significant amount of this is generated by the visitors. We arrived in Dingboche, which is the very famous monastery on this path, and started seeing all of the Chortens to climbers who have since died. This is Wonderberry Bishop, who did not die here in the Himalaya, but was a very important figure here. Sadly, just steps out of Dingboche was the first huge landfill that we found, just a mass of glass, plastics, metals that had been repeatedly burned, covered over, burned again. This was the start of the energy work and the awareness work more in depth for us now. And this is one of the solar heaters that you find everywhere. So the tourism and the trekking and climbing industries are really both a blessing and a curse. They are growing the economy. They are giving people a means of income in the local areas they never had before, but they're also severely damaging the environment. So the burning of shrubs, particularly shrub juniper, has been very devastating throughout the region. Of course, that adds to erosion, crumbling of the mountainsides, flooding, all sorts of environmental issues that people don't think about when they're burning a piece of wood at night. And this was especially being used throughout the lodges, which cater to those same visitors going through the park, looking for enjoyment in their mountain climbing, unfortunately damaging that very environment they're finding their livelihoods and hobbies in. This was my first view of the breathtaking Ama de Blam, 6,800 meters from Dingboche, the village where our scientists were going to be based to do most of the energy work at about 15,000 feet here in Dingboche. So they were looking at solar, wind, hydro, alternative energy sources. In fact, part of my check-in luggage had been pieces of a wind turbine to bring and test at this altitude, knowing that the output of energy would likely be lower than at sea level or lower elevations. The Khumbu Alpine Conservation Center is based here in Dingboche, and this is the hub of efforts to conserve the environment. We met with a council of villagers and leaders from the surrounding areas. They actually came quite a distance to meet with us, talk about the work we were doing, and also really brainstorm with us how to educate trekking, guiding companies and communities and the international community about their conservation efforts in the region and better stewardship as they traveled through. Sadly, this donkey that belonged to Sonam, our host in Dingboche, was being readied for a rescue. We were watching someone almost die of pulmonary edema after being in this gamma bag to no avail for many hours. So the reality of the altitude starts to set in here too, watching helicopter rescues daily. There really are quite a few groups trying to come together and help with conservation in the area and educating the passers through on this main thoroughfare up to Everest Base Camp and that whole region. This is the main water source for not only this village, but everything downstream to Namche Bazaar, and it gets quite a bit of traffic. As you'll see here, they're unloading those solar tubes and celebrating the fact that there were no more breakages between Lukla and here. So here's where I started meeting some more of the climbers. This was an Argentinian group, and really asking them about their water usage as well as what they would be willing to do to help in stewardship as they passed through the area. It was promising to hear how many of them were willing to either contribute to a guiding service if they were using one towards conservation projects, or actually step in themselves and help with any kind of projects that were going on, like this one here at the center where we were making installations. This is a helicopter coming in for a rescue. Yet one more foreign traveler who just felt a little ill and thought they needed a helicopter rescue to get out. So that too is adding to the environmental impact in the region. Even before I left home, I was startled by the misconceptions. I spoke with a good friend of mine who's an international guide, has summited K2 and Everest, an author, founder of corporate and business school leadership programs, world-renowned climber, who said the problem is the porters, not the trekkers or visitors, better than it was 20 years ago, and that the message is out there. So if the misconceptions are still active on the part of prominent people like this, of course that's going to get carried down to the average person taking a trip throughout the region. But you can see what's happening here to the people and the livestock and the environment. The chief scientist and I, who were a little more interested in some more physical challenges and activities, headed out towards Island Peak. So we went through Chakung here Another very popular trekking and now pretty popular climbing peak over to Island Peak. So this is another area that's pretty significantly impacted. That's Ama de Blam again from the north side, however. We wanted to go see the Island Peak Base Camp and Imja Lake, two areas that had previously been fairly affected with trash and also in great danger of a high glacial lake outburst happening at Imja Lake, which is more related to climate change than any kind of human impact on that environment. This is the spectacular yellow band on the face of Lhotse leading over to Everest. And some evidence of a lot of climbers' gear being carried through here on those horses as well. Porter rest lodges are one way to try and reduce impact if they have a place to stay with a way to be warm for the night, less likelihood of burning some of the shrub juniper while they're taking care of their climbers and trekkers along the way. You can see the spiderweb trails here that are incredibly problematic throughout the region, again adding to erosion and killing of what little plant life there is growing. This is the base camp at Island Peak, and in fact we did find both the waste dump and the garbage dump. Hydropower is another source of energy being looked at throughout the region. It is an unlimited source. It doesn't freeze with the speed of the waters moving, and there is enough to supply the entire continent of Asia with power if it were harnessed appropriately. It was nearing the end of the climbing season, so we watched train after train of yaks carrying gear out of base camp as we were trying to quickly assemble the alternative energy testing in Dingboche. A lot of questioning of climbers about their use of bottled water versus simply using boiled or treated water, and it was interesting to hear how many people had answers of why they wouldn't trust boiling their water. This was on our way out of Dingboche, actually heading up north towards base camp at this point in time. And you can really see the lay of the land and just how the water can be harnessed without damming or damaging the environment. The yaks are tremendous in terms of the loads they carry. And again, you see the sort of outrageous things that are carried up here at this point. The tourism is everywhere. And this is high up at Lobuche on our way to Gorak Shep, which is the last little village before you get to Everest Base Camp. We're walking along the Khumbu Glacier here, actually crossing it at some points and just listening to the massive sounds of rockfall, ice breaking, parts of the trail wiped out, as you could see there, straight down into the Khumbu Glacier. We're crossing another glacier here that's falling into it, so we're actually going through a lot of that and finding these dumps again. This is Gorak Shep, that last village. This is one of the most crowded areas. Animals are living in the middle of these dumps, and that is human waste being carried off of Everest Base Camp. Hundreds of kilograms of it a day. And there is the Khumbu Icefall Base Camp. Right now, a city of about 500 people at the height of the season in May. That's looking up the west shoulder, and that is actually a paraglider, that red dot that you see, paragliding off the summit of Everest that day we happened to be going up there. So base camp is like this city down here throughout the glacier. The rock walls just tower overhead as you're walking up to base camp there. Lots of accidents from rockfall throughout here. That's the Himex base camp actually. It's one of the largest of the three main guiding services up Everest. They charge about $55,000 a client. That was also a geodesic dome tent that you saw there, complete with leopard print rugs, big screen TVs, red leather chairs, and there are quite a few helicopters flying in and out of base camp these days. It's not for rescue, it's more often for delivering those kind of amenities, pork chops for dinner, bottles of wine. So it's really quite a scene going on at this time around Everest Base Camp. That's one of those helicopters coming in with a delivery. This was a nice surprise to find, an Italian research pyramid at about 15,700 feet, all kinds of atmospheric and environmental gadgets and experiments going on. They had two Italian climbers while we were there who actually put some atmospheric equipment up. That's their webcam of the summit of Everest. That's the guys on the South Col putting equipment up. They also put some on the summit of Everest while we were there. Now this is headed west and away from most of the crowds, thankfully, into a little more remote region over the Chola passes, up to about 17,500 feet, and there's a tremendous drop in impact of human traffic through here. Places I wish we'd been roped in. You can see it's a little steep, it's a little precarious. We had heavy packs on throughout this whole trek, but again, it was a relief to see less of the foil tobacco packets that are in fact litter from the porters, also less bottles, cans. And this was all a high plateau at about 17,500 feet. Once you get to the top of the Chola Pass, you are crossing glaciers up here, again listening to all of it cracking and moving below you, water melting and flowing below us, and our descent back to the other side was probably more precarious than the climb up, actually. This is headed towards Gokyo. We were headed down a very long valley. So despite the 7 or 8 excruciating hours it had been up and over the Chola Pass, rather than stay in Dragnak, which was a dark little town, we decided to go ahead and keep going to Gokyo and cross over yet another glacier. Several more hours to reach this beautiful site. This is Gokyo, and that was the pass we were crossing the next day, Renjola Pass, another almost 18,000 foot pass. That's Cholatse, a mountain I would love to climb one day. This is the edge of the lateral moraine looking into the glacier and across back to Cholatse. That's Cho-Oyu to the north. You'll see now all those trails cut into this mountainside. We'd been coming up from Gokyo, and this was a hose, the water source for that entire village coming down from the mountain. If one thing happens there, the water source stops. This is the top of Renjola Pass. And what we were climbing to get to the top of that, looking back, that's Everest, Lhotse. Makalu is in the background, Cholatse, and again our descent a little more precarious than the way up. We're now headed down into the Tame Valley, a much more remote region. Again, much less impact of tourists and trekkers. That's one of the ground cover that's unfortunately burned too often. You'll see large patches where that's just been removed. And again, trying to reduce the impact of that, they are bringing in things like kerosene and stove depots into the Khumbu Conservation Center. And here you can see we're getting lower again. We actually went all the way back to Namche Bazaar in a very short period of time. We had the unbelievable opportunity to attend the 50th anniversary of the Sir Edmund Hillary Kumjung School. There's also a great deal being done with conservation throughout there. And again, back and forth over that mountain multiple times in our last 3 days there left us a little worn out. That is trash carried off of Everest and being celebrated at this Golden Jubilee. Peter Hillary giving some awards, including to the Mountain Institute that I was there with. Less safe crossing those bridges with all of that. You see all those orange bags are being carried out and flown out of the mountains back through Qatar for us.